let's start. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us today, and great. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, we are in a time that everything is different. 2021. Also, we had a tough year, 2020. So, if you can explain now that you work with like massive expertise with the government and technology and the startups. Now, in terms of everything becoming digitalization in that way, what are the challenges that the governments are facing, and how they can actually use the technology to empower themselves towards the citizens and the society?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're so right to say we have undergone these tremendous challenges as societies, and at the heart of those challenges have been governments trying to figure out how to keep us healthy, how to keep the economy ticking, how to keep kids educated, and the sort of fourth emergency service that has emerged, after the police and the ambulances and the hospitals has been the technology sector, right? Because suddenly people are using and relying on technology in a way that they never had to do before, and obviously that's meant lots of companies have had to rethink what it means to work with technology, but so have governments. And what governments are finding is that they weren't quite as knowledgeable about the uses and abuses of technology that they probably thought they were, or they certainly are needing to become smarter now. And so we're seeing a whole range of things, from the good, the bad, and the ugly. You ask me, what are the sort of real challenges that they're facing? I mean, first of all, there is a lack of understanding. Understanding what technology can do, what you probably shouldn't ask of technology, and also, if you want technology to do something for you, what other kind of governance arrangements you need to put around it to make sure that things don't misfire. So in the UK, we had a particular example where, after the government decided to cancel school tests for kids in school, they obviously had to find a way in which to grade the kids, and decided, not unreasonably, to do it on past work. And obviously, in the modern day and age, they used an algorithm to calculate what the grades were. Needless to say, there were winners and there were losers, and people got very upset about the outcome. And the government was sort of, don't blame us, blame the rogue algorithm, right? Yeah. The idea of a rogue algorithm is obviously nonsensical. The government set the parameters for an algorithm to calculate, but the fact that government seemed not to really know what was going on, certainly weren't able to explain, didn't want to take the blame, ended up in this quite messy situation. And it just, I think, goes to show that there is a lack of understanding of what technology is and can do. So that's sort of the first issue. I think the second issue is, if you decide that you want something, you want to give all kids a way to access schooling, or you want to roll out a contact tracing app, how do you engage with the market in a way that allows you to get the best things that are out there, and not be sold fool's gold by great salespeople, and that all comes under the rubric of procurement. It's a very boring sounding subject, but it really goes to the heart of kind of how government accesses technology that it doesn't build itself. And here too, we have seen that government struggles to figure out how to buy, especially innovative technology. So I'd say that's your sort of your second bit, and I think the third bit is, it speaks to the question of how does government work effectively with partners in the digital ecosystem to deliver things, even when it's not the government that's going to deliver the outcome themselves. Government has to ensure the delivery of a number of key public services that it actually doesn't deliver itself. Of course, it delivers policing because it owns the police service, but it doesn't deliver, fire services. It doesn't deliver, healthcare, et cetera, in certain places. So how does it work? How does government work with, technology providers and other partners in order to ensure the delivery of something that it plays a role in but isn't wholly in charge of. And that still is clearly being resolved now.
Right. And we're also talking about two different systems, right? We're talking about the government system and the technology, two different structures, how they operate and even how they think. Traditional and like exponential, I would say, right? And you work in this intersection. Specifically for this year and the COVID, if you can explain how you have been interacting with the government and with the tech, and how difficult is it? Because you might actually have seen the magnitude, difficulty of interacting or being a liaison or even advising the both parties. How difficult is it specifically after this like pandemic?
Yeah, great question. I mean, so for the benefit of your listeners, I built a company called Public after about 20 years in public service, and we build technology, our own products. We invest and accelerate technology startups that want to work on delivering better public services. But we also bring together the ecosystem, whether physically at a co-working space in the middle of the government district in London, Whitehall, or at large sort of buyers events like the GovTech Summit. And then we also run training programs for governments to better understand technology. So we run across a wide range of touch points with government. I guess you say you put it quite well. You talked about the difference between the two systems, and you mentioned the difference between a static and an exponential system, but you could also say the difference between a hierarchical system and a flat system, the difference between a get it done now versus a get it done safely system. The startup ecosystem is a sort of get it done now mentality, and the government system is a get it done safely. And those are also clashes. So on a number of dimensions, these two systems operate very differently. But what COVID really has done is it has done a couple of things. First of all, it has imposed a time sensitivity in government that is more akin to what people are used to in the startup and technology ecosystem, right? You have to get this done now, right? We have to get test and trace done now. We have to get ventilators in the hospitals now. We have to get vaccines out now. And so we're operating in a kind of almost we can call COVID time that has constrained decision making, making it much more akin to the way that we operate. And that has, in a way, been helpful because it means that a lot of people in government have having to confront these constricted timelines, are having to think, how do we operate differently? And then are looking at the technology community going, oh, we can learn a lot from them. So that in a way has been positive. The second thing it has done is it has put an emphasis on the need to solve something fast. And I don't just mean, I talked about the time dimension before, but this is about come up with a solution. It might not be the perfect solution, but it'll be better than having no solution. And that again
is it efficient? Is it efficient just to fast
no,
forward?
in many cases it isn't, but it is the MVP culture that we know from technology, which is enormously powerful as a methodology and as a culture, right? Because it's okay, let's test, let's ship something, let's see what the reaction is, let's improve it. If not, we withdraw it. If it's great, we build on it. Whereas government tends to be, let's spend a long time figuring out what the perfect solution is. And so I think this environment has not only, as I said, made things faster, but it has also made governments think more, well, what does the MVP version of this look like? Let's get it out there. If we save some lives, it's better than if we save everybody, but it's too late because everybody will be done by then anyway. So those two things. Now, at the same time, these are the two positive trends. There are lots of negative trends, right? Which is these large bureaucracies have really struggled to kind of, operate differently. And we see a great example in the difference between the way that the UK has been able to purchase and roll out vaccines compared to the European Union. In the UK, they allocated responsibility for purchasing to a small task force led by a venture capitalist who approached the
Hmm.
job as she would her day job, making
Privatize
strategic
it.
bets. Yeah. And whereas the EU approached it in a much more kind of traditional bureaucratic way, and as a result, one has an excess of vaccines and rolling them out rapidly, and the other is not. And that also shows how difficult it still is for some bureaucracies.
Exactly. I mean, you mentioned about fast forwarding and how the government's looking forward, have changed their outlook. I mean, look at FDA, for example. They're, like the process of approving a drug or a test. We can see like how tremendously they've been open-minded, and but now that you work with these two sectors, and specifically during COVID, how do you advise the government in order to adapt that kind of like technology? Also, we're also talking about the society and what is actually happening during this time. I think which would actually go to the next topic, that perhaps we would talk about the factor of trust.
Yeah. So the
But
first, well, I was just going to say, the government needs to do a number of things, which is what we're telling them. Is one, be clear about the thing that you need to do as a government, and then what you can rely on the private market to do. There's way too much confusion about, governments trying to build technology in competition against, the largest, most successful technology companies. That's never going to work. At the same time, governments are often too willing to let technology companies, for example, Google and Apple, decide things that really are about public health choices that governments, democratically elected governments, should decide. So, first be clear about what it is that government should do. Render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar. Render unto God what belongs to God. Like be clear about what is for Caesar and what is for God, what is for the government and what is for the technology. Second thing is be much more open-minded about how problems can be solved. Government is, the great benefit of government is that it does the thing that it does, and you can rely on it to a large degree. But with that way of working comes a kind of closed-mindedness about how to deliver things in new ways. And technology and the technology ecosystem is all about kind of coming up with new ways in which we can deliver a thing. And so government needs to be open-minded about how they can ultimately deliver the goal. And it may be that the thing that they've been doing for years is no longer the way to deliver that goal, even if the goal, for example, making sure that everybody is in school and taught the right material, or that people are diagnosed with health issues fast. The objective remains the same, but be open-minded about how you can maybe deliver on it. So those are some things. And then you clearly segue into, and there's a neat segue into this bigger issue, which is, and of all the things that government still needs to do, trust is enormously important. Um, Especially in the light of some recent, discussions and decisions around, ex-President Trump's, Twitter account and other things. Government play an enormously important role, should play an enormously important role in creating an environment of trust. And there's an argument that government has not, done what they need to do in order to create that environment.
Exactly. You mentioned censorship, and now there's a big, obviously, wave of censorship that we can see post COVID, or maybe it was before, and now there's actually a bigger light into that. We are looking at the big tech and big government, so therefore we have a big problem here, and specifically with the recent censorships aside, and also what is actually happening in the stock market and the Wall Street and all these like movements, democratization, decentralization versus centralization. What is your intake? We've had people talking about, the recent event and the GameStop in terms of financial terms, but we never had anybody talking about the political and the governance aspect of that. So it would be great to hear from you and your take on that.
Well, you're opening a lot of issues. Let me try to kind of start from one end. I think the way it feels to me is that we are living in a world with some old terms that are inappropriate for the modern, fast-moving world that we live in. Take the word censorship. when we use the word censorship, we tend to mean, a state exercise that is imposed on people, right? If I don't want to speak to you on the phone, you don't call it censorship, right? If I don't want to have a chat to you, you don't call it censorship. If I don't want to allow you to come into my house, then you don't call it censorship. We have another way of thinking about it. And so we have these terms, censorship, freedom of speech, and so on, and we're applying them in this other context. And I don't think that's quite appropriate. I don't think it's right to say that, say, Twitter is censoring Donald Trump. It's Twitter's right to do whatever they want on their platform,
Right.
because government, Twitter is not a utility. It's not, you don't have the right to Twitter like you have the right to clean, water. Now we might decide that actually no, we think Twitter is a utility, and then we have to create the legal framework around it. But all I'm saying is, until we make that decision, to me, these are not issues around freedom of speech or censorship, but they're around the extent to which we will allow private players to do what they want on their platforms. And one of the big issues I've always been mostly concerned about is not so much the responsibility for content moderation by platforms themselves, but what happens when we go down deeper into the stack? What happens when what do we want to tell AWS is their responsibility to host somebody's service? What do we want to tell Stripe is their responsibility to run the payment systems? And I think we have to be very careful we don't enforce responsibilities so far down the stack that private companies that are supplying services but far away from the actual content are held responsibility. Let's just take one absurd example. Parler probably has an office somewhere, even though I doubt many people are in there given COVID, but they have an office, and somebody supplied them with office chairs, and somebody runs the air conditioning, and somebody caters to them. And to what extent are all these businesses responsible for the content of Parler? Well, obviously they're not, but I use the analogy simply to say these are incredibly complex issues that we need policymakers to think about, rather than just say, yeah or nay. On the GameStop side, look, I'm not a financial analyst, but it strikes me that there is a lot of naivety about what's going on, right? It strikes me that what we're not seeing is, a democratic horde against a small group of, hedge funds. What it looks to me like is a horde with a bunch of hedge funds as well against another group of hedge funds, right? And so we just need to be a little bit sensible about who is actually playing, and not, I think, fall victim to some of the narratives that are being pumped out by people. I think also the real risk, something like Robinhood and similar offerings in the market, have on the one hand allowed millions of retail customers to involve themselves in what was previously the preserve of only the very few, but also at the risk of them not necessarily understanding how the system operates, for good or for bad, right?
Exactly.
And so there's this risk of a frustration because people are realizing something they should have realized before, which is that these platforms, they have liabilities they need to cover, they have responsibilities vis-a-vis the regulator, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is, this GameStop is going to go down. And so it's basically, in my view, a Ponzi scheme. You just got to get in there and get out of there faster than the guy who's a bit stupider than you. And that's ultimately a Ponzi scheme. And so it's not, to me, it's not surprising that these platforms and these regulators are concerned about that behavior. And it's not surprising to me either that the Redditors haven't quite realized what they're playing with. So, and taking a step back, it's great to see retail investors involve themselves, but we're not going to see a world, I suspect, where regulators are going to say, knock yourself out, do whatever you want, because politicians are not going to be happy about retail investors being burnt as a result of that.
Right. I mean, you definitely mentioned about the platforms and they're kind of like it's private company. They can do what they want. Obviously, there's no doubt about deplatforming an individual or certain contents, but it's always about transparency. You always want to create that kind of like trust, right? And I think that would have mattered in those cases. And also, you mentioned a great point about like now they're like different individuals are involved. It's mostly private, hedge funds and the retail investors, and even some other hedge funds. But do we really trust? Who do we really trust to come and become the mediator to solve this? Do we trust the government? Because we have seen in the past global financial crisis, 2018, or even like every day Wall Street, all these big companies, hedge funds, banks, they actually violate certain rules, and they just pay the fine, which is really a big deal for them. But I think with the saga, what has actually come to the light for retail investors, for even like advocates and influencers that are actually bringing this campaign, into light more and more, we can see that there's still a lot of traditional model being clashing with the modern model, and also technology kind of like getting stuck here. And you mentioned about Robinhood. It actually did democratize the system. It allowed a lot of people to get involved, but it was for like certain, obviously, incentives. Talking about data is very, very important these days. And I'm not just inferring or trying to provide any misinformation, but based on my readings, was that obviously Robinhood was selling those data to one of their big investors. Obviously,
so you raise a bunch of issues that is worth maybe like taking one at a time. So the first bit, I entirely agree with you. Trust matters and transparency matters, and the fact that large social media platforms have been less than transparent about requirements, procedures, standards that they intend to fulfill means that when they do act, people become suspicious. Twitter benefited tremendously from having Donald Trump on the platform for years and years.
right.
And we have probably all of us been involved one way or another in either
Contributing.
all of us on social media have probably witnessed or been subject to various forms of abuse that we believe are incompatible with any kind of sense of standards. Yet in most cases, little has been done to do anything about it, and then in other cases, somehow. So I entirely agree with you, and I do think that we have reached a point where we can no longer allow for self-regulation. Governments need to step in, democratically mandated, to set up. Now, how do you do that? How do you avoid an overreaction? How do you coordinate with other bodies, since these companies are global? That is the great question of our time, and no doubt lots of people will try to resolve it. So that's sort of one, and I totally agree with you. I think the second point is the question is who sets the rules for the market? Winston Churchill famously said, "Democracy is the worst possible system except any other." And I have not seen a convincing argument that the way that we regulate financial markets is worse than the alternative, right? I don't see anybody articulating an alternative, to the SEC, or in the UK, the Prudential Regulator and the FCA. I don't see it. And so it's one thing to say, we're unhappy about the way that it works, but it also works 99% of the time. Money's flowing through the system. It gets money into your ATM. Your salary is paid. Investments are made, et cetera, et cetera. So 99% of the time, this system works to drive growth. Now, you might argue that there are some unintended consequences of the system, some market failures that need to be addressed. For example, climate change and so on. But I think people are trying to figure out how to deal with that. And I would argue that even if we can adjust with that, it's a sign that the system is evolving itself. So I just don't know what the kind of alternative system of regulation is. Who should regulate us? well, democratically elected governments appointing regulators who are regulating us. And just on the Robinhood, there's an old saying, uh, if you're not paying, are you sure you're the client? I don't know exactly what Robinhood has sold or not sold, but I think that point stands to reason. If you're not paying, then make sure that you know who the actual client is. And a lot of
Right.
retail investors are probably waking up today, wondering whether the trade-off that they thought they were making is exactly the one that they're happy with.
I mean, great points. I totally agree with what you raised. But the problem is, I believe, what these regulators or even like big players in specifically, for example, in the case of GameStop and Wall Street, is, for example, if the U.S. regulators are kind of like enforcing a regulation, the Canadian regulators might actually enforce that to the system and to the market, which would again bring a lot of questions, right? And then the discussion is, this is free market. For in the free market, you need to let it, you know, be there. Everybody should participate. And now people want a decentralized system.
Well, hang on.
Um,
A free market doesn't mean everybody does what they want. I mean, we live in
no, but in
regulated
terms
free
of
markets.
contribution, yes,
Yeah,
like free
we believe in
market.
regulation, right? You're not allowed to pour whatever chemical you want into the sewer. You're not allowed to build, your factory on certain land, and you're not allowed to sell certain financial products to certain people. I mean, that's regulation, right? Every market needs parameters and needs rules and regulations and somebody to govern those rules. I don't know what the alternative is.
No, great point. Great point. And we also need to clarify on that one. So now that like everybody's talking about these issues, some believe that the solution might be a decentralized system, no power controlling. And then obviously they're talking about public ledgers, blockchain. So what is your take? And then even like some cryptocurrency or even like Bitcoin.
Yeah. So I think let's make a distinction between the, the decentralization opportunity and then cryptocurrencies. They're related but not the same, as you know. So I think we will see increasing decentralization of a lot of things. But like products in the real world or services, things succeed and scale when they solve a problem at the right price point. And all I would say is on decentralization, there will be certain things where a decentralized solution solves a problem at the right price point and they will succeed. And there will be other areas where decentralization does not solve the problem at the right price point. And therefore, decentralization is unlikely to be the solution. And I mention that because I see often that governments are being told they need to use distributed ledger technology in order to deliver their core services. But the answer is that in many cases government is not going to want to do that because government is about centralized control. And so government will say, well, why should we be using a distributed ledger system when we're being held responsible for the thing at the center that we got to maintain control? Or why should we use a distributed ledger system when all we need to do is to use a secure database of some kind, right? So
Right.
my point here is we're going to see decentralization of lots of things, but not everything. And I think the question is, where are the great use cases? So I think, for example, obviously we know what the components of the great use cases are. When you have many to one relationships, when there's no central authority, et cetera, et cetera. I could well imagine that we will see much more use of decentralized mechanisms when it comes to, trading carbon removals and things like that. Because, if I'm removing some carbon in a field in Idaho, and you're trying to purchase something, in Geneva, Switzerland, how on earth, kind of you manage that transaction? I can sort of see that, and there are many other areas. what I'm just not convinced that yet is like the whole world is going to become decentralized, because at the end of the day, humans, since the writings of Thomas Hobbes and about the Leviathan, we have a need for some central authority in certain of our affairs. And if we
Right.
do not have that authority, then, the war on everyone, is likely to emerge. So that's what I
That's
think about
part of the humanity, I believe. Authority and control and power.
Yeah, and I think I just think, don't forget that there is a benign story. There was Thomas Hobbes and his book The Leviathan, who basically saw life as nasty, brutish, and short, and the Leviathan needed to be created in order to kind of control man. And then there was John Locke, who came along with a much more liberal concept, which is no, I mean, we need the centralizing authority in order to do positive and good things. And I think we probably ended up somewhere in the middle. And when I hear the debates around decentralization, I sort of hear a little bit of political naivety around the extent to which systems are going to be allowed to devolve to that degree of decentralization, because
Right.
I think ultimately humans will want certain things to be, they want to blame somebody, they want to hold somebody to account, they want to affect change
Exactly.
somewhere.
Mm. And then they would blame the decentralized world probably. But before you go, tell us more about Public and what kind of culture you have created, obviously with this great mindset that you have, and also how are you helping the entrepreneurs in that area?
No, I'd love to. As I was saying to you earlier, I spent most of my life in public service, and I just grew incredibly frustrated by the fact that everywhere I looked around, advertising, retail, insurance, technology was just transforming things at breakneck speed. And inside the government, it just felt like it was going so slowly. We were working with the same big vendors. We were operating, big waterfall systems. We weren't operating in an agile, iterative way. And so I left and I built Public with my co-founder, Alex de Carvalho, who came out of a sort of startup and investment background, in order to say, well, how can we bring these different cultures together, and how can we help innovators who think fast, who think in an agile way, who think in an innovative manner to deliver some of these services. And so we run a big accelerator program called GovStart, where we take in sort of Y Combinator style founders who want to build businesses focused on public service transformation, and we help them. And we help them in the traditional way. How do you build a business? But also, how do you build a business, especially for public service attention? And in order to do that, you asked about the culture. Well, the answer is we're a sort of fusion culture, right? Because we have got to
Exactly.
fuse people
As
who
an
kind of,
insider.
we've got to have people who care about public service, people who care about technology, people who care about investment, people who care big transformation, and we got to fuse all that together. And I guess if I had to say what that looks like, it's a young, flat, quite energetic team, and I think that's the way you have to build yourselves up if you're trying to be a fusion culture.
Well, that's great because I've actually looked at the previous summits that you had in previous years. Very high caliber speakers and influentials, really. Uh, how do you think that even like with that level of popularity in politics, and obviously having an entrepreneur, in front of that individual talking about their product and their problems, do they get intimidated, or is there a bottleneck?
I think the issue is making sure people maybe take a step back. What I would say from our experience hosting the GovTech Summit and other similar events that bring technologists and policymakers together is that it's easy to have many concurrent conversations going on at the same time. It's much harder to have conversations that are genuinely sort of between the different groups, right? It's easy to have a policymaker come and say their bit, and then have an entrepreneur come and say their bit, and then some of the words may cross over, but in actual fact, they're sort of slightly apart from each other. That's easy. It's much harder to ensure that they have a genuine conversation together. And so we always try at the GovTech Summit to shy away from big set speeches and say, no, this is about a dialogue. And so we try to enforce senior policymakers from prime ministers down to participate in conversations with startup founders, because the startup founder is sort of on the ground, is telling them quite directly what's going on, and that can be enormously valuable to the policymaker. And in reverse, the person on the ground needs to hear like what's to the left and to the right of arc. What is the space to innovate that I need to focus on. So that's what we try to do, to bring those two together. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Most of the time, it's fun.
I actually just remembered that what the role that public is playing is, because politicians have to travel to different regions and to the different stakeholders to understand what the problem is when they're campaigning, and you're actually bringing that campaign to them literally. And I think that's the efficiency, because I, as an entrepreneur, for example, if I have a company and if I am solving a problem, sitting with a policymaker or a political figure, I am directly, all the problems. And I think this is much more effective, and because I am actually part of a ecosystem that are listening constantly with kind of like customer service and engagement, marketing, and I think this is much more effective than what you do. And before you go, one more question: how are you handling public right now in the COVID time? How are you dealing with the different companies?
Yeah, I mean, we have carried on working, and you won't be surprised to hear that we're obviously, we have a better year this year than last year because of the nature of what we focus on. But we went totally virtual or remote as fast as we could, and have continued to operate, but only via remote working. And we've managed to do that, I think, not only because we had the digital infrastructure to do that, cloud-based and so on. We were able to do that because I think we have a very strong culture. We over communicate with each other, whether it's on messaging systems or meetings. We meet the whole company twice a week, which is a large cacophonous meeting, but is a chance for everybody to really kind of see all their colleagues and maybe remind themselves of the need to chat to this or that colleague in a way they probably would have done naturally if they met by the water cooler. So we spend a lot of time working with our colleagues to ensure that they speak to each other, they communicate, to keep the ethos alive. And I think we have succeeded. I would prefer not to run an entirely remote company. I think humans need three-dimensional, contact.
Exactly.
And at some point soon we'll be back. And until then, we'll do our very best.
Yes, exactly. And I know how easy it was to actually be kind of contacted with you. So that explains the culture that we are running in your company. And thank you so much again for your time. I also wanted to ask if you would be available perhaps in the next week or so to have you hosted on the Clubhouse. There's so many people there. They would love to hear about public, your views specifically on the buzzes going on in GameStop.
I'd be delighted to join you, and thank you very much for inviting me on today.
Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.